again, if as we still have a few more minutes. We still have a few more minutes as people come in. I am starting the YouTube recording a little early. If I learn how, I will set up some sort of thing, because the YouTube is on like a delay. So when I'm speaking, you hear it like 15, 20 seconds later. So if you're watching the videos afterwards, right, just we start out with a few minutes, you can just jump a few minutes in. Hopefully that's not an issue. If the playback quality gets too low, send me a message. The technology that I mean, this is not a perfect setup. And then, because no one's on the video, we might actually transition away from YouTube, just because I don't know how, but right now there are more people on YouTube than there are on WebEx. So you should see quiz 3 up tonight. It's going to be essay. What you're also going to see is a poll question, and this is going to be extra credit. So all the answers are worth like half a point or whatever. And I'm just going to ask you a few questions about where you would want to go forward. I know some of you don't want to be up at 8:30 in the morning, and that's one of the best parts about this being, online or remote as well as in person, is that you can watch it at your own pace or whatever it is. And I had a number of views. I actually had more views than I had students, so I'm a little concerned about that. But there were a lot of views. So if you guys want to switch to all one or the other, in WebEx you should be able to talk to me. I think it's supposed to work that way. I haven't heard from anyone on the WebEx either way. So it really depends on what people like. I didn't see anyone in the Web Campus chat. No one communicated there. So that's going to be gone. It's just one less thing that I have to take care of. So that is something I will pull out. That I will remove from the sort of simulcast, and then if I get them both on one camera, we'll see about that. But it's really, I think the biggest thing is like changing the slides, and then my touchpad is, my hands shake already. So if you would prefer something, I'm going to ask a poll question and then an essay portion. Answer the question, right? The part that is multiple choice for the extra credit. But if you don't want to add any comments, don't feel pushed to do that. I really just want you to be able to give me feedback in a way that helps you. And like, as you can tell, I am not great about technology, but all of the setup, right, really is just to help you. So if it's too much, if you're like, I don't want to get YouTube and WebEx, I don't want both of them, right, we can try and consolidate. If it's important to you that we have these recorded, and you can go back and watch them because you're like, I don't know what he was talking about, or I had to do something, or whatever it was, right? If that's important to you, then that can be an option. I like them being recorded. I like you being able to go back if you want. I like being able to sort of contact me directly. So those are all options. How do we get it here? Why is this so set up poorly? Okay, I got a few people in the YouTube. I've got, about 8 people in. But at that time, and we are a bit behind. So the first thing, I will, a lot of these things I'm going to update. I'll send out announcements, because I know speaking to them and actually you guys knowing what's happening is 2 different things. So you guys are in. I'm assuming you can hear me. I can see the audio working, so hopefully if there's anything. I know I got off on a tangent, but I promise you that this diversity communication we had, one, it is really one of these great things that is scientifically proven. There's so much evidence behind it about diversity, but also it's so informative about what we're actually doing in this classroom, is that when you have a diverse group, you expect different behavior. And some of it's really bad, right? My specialty for a long time was about ethnic conflict, about how different ethnic groups were much more likely to go to war, to fight each other, to kill each other. But we see when you have rule of law, when you have a group of people who aren't violent towards each other, who are diverse, you get really positive benefits, right? That diversity has costs, right? That there are social costs, right? That there are language costs, there are language barriers. But when you can break down some of those barriers by having sort of shared values and identity, right? Especially in the United States, we can say we're all Americans, right? Even if we're sort of immigrants, we can always say, right, we have this sort of shared American identity of valuing things. And one of those values is this diversity, right? And unfortunately, I saw Hamilton for the first time this week, so you're going to get a little bit of the immigrants to get the job done sort of language. So I apologize if it comes across that way. I am way behind on whatever pop references exist, so I apologize. If it seems a little one-sided, obviously it's there. All right, so we were talking about diversity, but we were sort of already at these temporal factors. And I'm going to... The first thing, I will send out an announcement. Whatever I don't cover when we get to exam one, we're going to do Scotch Poem. We have to do Scotch Poem Guess. It is so important. But Scotch Poem Guess is next week. We're definitely going to do that. So all the reading until Scotch Poem Guess, we're definitely going to cover. And you'll see we'll pick up the pace a little bit. I'm really hammering down these positions for now. But when we do like Scotch Poem Guess, I've read them so many times. I'm a little more fluid with them, but also I get really passionate about them. When we get to exam one, I think there are a couple of readings coming into that. If we get there, like we're going to cover chapter 4 of this, we're going to cover process tracing and other factors. We're going to do a little more quantitative, qualitative. We're going to do the logic of comparison in Peter's chapter. We're going to do Scotch Poem Guess in the next week and that what follows. And we might move things around a little. But I think what we're going to do is pull a few readings here and there. I don't want to pull anything that we've already covered because you've read it. I assume that when you come to class, you've read the material that was assigned. So I don't want to say, oh, you read it, well, too bad we're not covering it, we're not going to test on it. That's not fair. So Scotch Poem Guess is in, but then moving forward, we might take a day, a week where we said, okay, we've got all this stuff to cover and we're behind. Between technology and engagement, right, I really wanted to cover these things. And because your first essay question is going to be this week, it'll give me a chance to say, okay, what do I need to stop repeating? Okay, you get the independent variables are causes and dependent variables are effects. You guys know this positivist view, you know ontology, you get those things, I can stop working on those. And to coalesce on what really needs to be the argumentation. And then after we get into after we take the methodology exam, right, about understanding the methodology and the ontology and sort of the science of it all, right? When we get into the regimes, the democracy and the authoritarian regimes, we'll all be on the same page in the same language, and we won't have to worry about as many speed bumps. Okay, so about viewers, lost a few, but that's okay. I had way more views than I think were students, so I think I only had like 27 registered students. It's actually, we barely made. One of the weird things is we had lost like 3 students, the class would have been canceled. So it's already a small class. I will mention I do have a student in class today. There's like 200 seats in this room, or like 150 seats in this room. So if you're more comfortable being in the classroom, you're always welcome to come here. I haven't had anyone message me about like office hours. And look, when I had office hours in like 2018 and 2019, no one came by then either. So I'm not like surprised that we're not doing office hours now. But because it's sort of live or WebEx or webcam or whatever we're going to do, just know that you can message me and say, hey, on Thursday at 6 p.m., I have a couple hours and I'd really like to, I might say no, because who knows what else I'm doing. But if I have the time, I might say, okay, Thursday at 6 p.m., let's set up a WebEx, let's talk, let's figure these things out. I have bought a new laptop, I got a WebEx, I got a webcam loan, I have all the technology that we can do that, so don't feel like you can't do that. After exam one, I think we'll see that some of you really are struggling with it. We're going to talk about how to move forward, right? I believe that every student should have a chance to fail and then recover. So we're going to talk about that a lot. So I'm already way behind. I will stop dragging that out. Let's get into temporal factors. So in about 1904, 1905, the car hadn't been invented. And this is a story actually from Silicon Valley, but right, they steal it from us, we steal it from them. The show, not the actual place. And so before the invention of the car, there was this concern about manure, right? There was this concern that like their horses were going down the streets of New York, and it was getting more and more populated, and there were just so many people, and an economist said that at the current population growth, that in 10 years, the level of manure would be 9 feet high on the streets of New York. Well, in 1914, there's no manure on the streets of New York, right? 1920, probably more likely, because the car is invented, right? It's a shift in the entire society of New York, right? And then the entire world, right, follows that, right? The typewriter industry collapses, right, in the 1990s because home computers become so popular, no one needs a typewriter. It's not a worthwhile invention. So technology changes our lives in a lot of ways, right? Our behavior becomes very different. We will see that when we talk about moving forward, as you become farther into adulthood and educated and sort of professionals, you're going to talk about the pre and post COVID life, right? What is the world like after COVID? Because we will fundamentally change how we behave. Behavior will be different after this period, right? The way we interact with each other, the way we behave, how comfortable are working from home, or on web chat, or Zoom, or whatever it is, talking to people that we know, or FaceTime. Virtual communication will either become very popular, or what you'll see, what could be the case, is that in a few years after sort of we've gotten better, we might reject virtual communication because we want to be in face-to-face because it was taken away from us, right? Sometimes when something's taken away, you see a re-embrace of it at a high level. My generation will talk about a pre- and post-9/11 world, right? I was in the Army during 9/11. I had just joined the Army, I was still in training. But the world before 9/11 is dramatically different. Our behavior is different, our culture is different. So when we look at those temporal factors, right, every generation is going to point to a time where their values changed, where their culture changed. And so that's very important, right? In the 1860s, right, the United States decided that every child should go to school, right? This became sort of Brown's idea, right? That there was a scholar who said public education just be made available for everyone. Because there was not public schools until about the 1860s. The 1860s are the first public schools, and it's not until the turn of the 20th century that we still public education becomes big. So it changes our society. In comparative politics, we do see technology change, but one of the other temporal factors is that values dramatically change, right? And I'm going to use the American example, even though, right, we do have some great sort of comparative politics example. I want to use an example that you know so it's going to be very clear. In the 1990s, if you ask someone about a trans person, the word itself would be so foreign that they wouldn't understand the question you were asking, right? That if you said, okay, would you be accepting of a trans person? They would say, I don't know what that is. It wouldn't be, I do accept it, I don't accept it. I don't understand what it is, right? There is no value because it wasn't discussed at any level. Now, obviously, trans people existed before the 1990s, but the point is that there was no concern about that group because it wasn't recognized at all, right? One of the things that happens in sort of the 1950s is this idea that there are no lesbians, right? That the lesbians don't exist. Well, because they weren't discussed, they weren't witnessed, and because people didn't feel safe to identify them, right? So they weren't less of them, right? They just didn't feel safe to come out into the public. And I know I sound very liberal at this point, but I don't actually care about your values. I'm using it as explanatory as how values change in the United States. In the 1970s, right, you have Loving v. Virginia, which is a Supreme Court case where a black man was married to a white woman. A black woman was married to a white man, the Loving couple. They get married. And then they get arrested because it's an interracial marriage, right? Our values change over time. The idea that an interracial couple would be arrested because they got married is nonsensical in the 21st century, right? That can't be law, right? Because one in the 1970s really were in court. So we have this shift, right? That's our value shift. In the international community, you see a shift in what it means to be a state. So Fenimore's this book is actually international relations, but the point is that norms are always changing. Our values are always changing. They never stay the same. They change rapidly, and they don't change purposefully. This becomes one of those things that when you're talking about a value, you're not always intentionally driving it in a certain direction. And I know a lot of the examples we're using are about the LGBTQIA community. That's not really the relevant point. That's not the reason I'm using it. I'm using it because as a younger population, you're much more likely to know about that community and understand the sort of things that are happening right now, right? When I talk about Loving v. Virginia or interracial issues or segregation, it's not really connected to your identity or your social construct, right? So this becomes, all of these temporal factors become sort of this context. The context that you would miss from a positivist worldview. Now, in the 20th century, starting about the 1950s, you run into this argument made by scientists, specifically chemists, physicists, hard scientists, what we call the natural sciences. And in natural sciences, a positivist view is just better. It's just better, right? If you want to know at what temperatures cookies bake, right? I have a colleague who's a chemist and got a job for a company finding the best cookies that could be baked at 350 degrees, right? Just what were the best, what could be made in less than 10 minutes at 350 degrees, and how do we change those cookies, right? That's just putting them in the oven, changing the ratio of flour and sugar and butter and whatever else is in a cookie, right? That's pure science in an observable world. Doesn't matter perception, right? It's always going to be 350 degrees. Everyone's going to see 350 degrees on the thermometer. The time is not relative in that situation, right? Everyone's going to be looking at the same things, testing the same things, is purely positives. So what happens, this economic term that they were concerned about that we're going to be talking about now, is that social sciences, anthropology, political science, sociology, psychology, they say, well, we should be positivist. We should have this scientific world where we can observe causes. We can directly observe causes. And it becomes this sort of emulation, this envy of the natural sciences, where we want to be more like the natural sciences. Well, there's obviously a problem with that, right? If you're a postmodernist, right, you have this postmodernist view, you say, well, the world isn't just observable, doesn't just exist, it's socially constructed. And I've talked about this before. When you talk about socially constructed, all I mean is you have a group of people who live in somewhat close proximity who decide something, who decide it's true. Witches in Salem are socially constructed. They agreed those people were witches, and their view of the world is that witches exist and that those people were witches, right? Probably false, right? And I only use probably because why not, right? There's no evidence that witches exist, right? There's no scientific evidence that witches exist. And I don't mean Wiccans is a religion that exists in the United States, that they can be witches and be identified as witches, but not witches in the same sense. The other parts about social construct that really matter here are things that you can't prove or disprove. Values and identity. Now, a value is a normative aspect, but it's usually based on something. In certain parts of the world, right, they are very, very against anyone who is not straight. And part of this is religious, right? If you look at Christian religion, right, you see like this argument against homosexual behavior, That's a religious aspect. If you look at the Philippines, or you look at Malaysia, it's not about a religious aspect. It's that they want their economy to grow. And if you want your economy to grow, one of the easiest ways to get your economy to grow is just to have more people. If you have more people, your economy will get bigger, because they'll be out working and making money and spending money, and your economy will grow larger. So Malaysia actually had a commercial that they aired encouraging people to have sex and make babies, right? That is a very designed program, and part of that became this thing that people, as a responsibility to their country, needed to have children. If you look at Lincoln, right, during the Civil War, he said to mothers of the nation, he said, we were going to need more sons, right? A recognition that his was sending their sons to die, and therefore more sons needed to happen. The terrorist group Hamas, right, whatever language, right? Hamas, in its charter, identifies women as the productive capacity of a fighting force, right? So there's this obligation for them to have children, and that's in their values. Sometimes religiously constructed, sometimes economically constructed, sometimes structured as productive capacity, right? But these are socially constructed, right? They're values. It's good to have children because of A, or X, or whatever it is. So when you have something like that, you can't just observe it and say it exists in the world, because it's arbitrarily designed to give it value, right? If you were to look at, right, the value of all of those things, right, they don't have consistency. They're socially constructed. The next part is identity. And we're going to talk about identity later in the semester, so I want you to get to an introduction. And Dr. Tom Dunford, I had a class with him, and I've heard this actually quite a bit from experts in the field, and they say, who's an Arab? Right? Dr. Tom Dunford would say this. I had other professors when I was getting my master's in Sacramento. Those who identify as Arab or Iranian or from that area would say, well, who do you think is Arab? And they would say, anyone who says they're Arab. That was their answer. If you say you are that identity, then you're that identity, right? If you say that you are Jewish, then you're Jewish, right? And so from that perspective, being Arab is saying we're Arab. That's internal. That's you identifying internally as that, which means there are no outward aspects that matter. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, or your age, or your religion. Being Arab is not about being from the Arabian Peninsula, right? Because many Arabs are not from, right? If you're from Libya or Tunisia, that's northern Africa. That's not the Arabian Peninsula. But they would still identify as Arab because it's in this internal aspect. Now, as opposed to this internal aspect where I say that's my identity and therefore that's who I am, which is totally valid. If that's the social construct, is you identify as your ethnicity, your religion, right, your gender, whatever it is, if that's the social construct and you say this is who I am, then the society accepts you who are, it's not relevant if it's positivist, it's that is the socially constructed identity. The other part is an external identity. And from that perspective, they would say anyone who's called an Arab is Arab, right? And this becomes this problematic aspect of identity. If you are from Southern California and you are Hispanic, right, the white majority population will make an assumption that you're from Mexico, right? That's very common, right? That Hispanics in California are often sort of lumped in as Mexicans. It's very racist, but it happens. If you were to go to the East Coast, there would not be that social construct, right? If you see someone who's Hispanic on the East Coast, depending on where you're at on the East Coast, right, the assumption that they would be Puerto Rican or Cuban, right? That's an external identity. Now, part of the thing about external identities is the person who gets that external identity doesn't get to choose whether or not they're in that group. It's not concealable and it's not escapable. And by escapable, it becomes this question of, can you hide it from the population when you're at risk? And this is compared to politics. Remember, as problematic as things are in American society, you're not going to get murdered because you're albino in the United States, right? Whereas we know in sub-Saharan Africa, right, that often albinos, especially albino males in sub-Saharan Africa, can get murdered because there's a belief that they have certain powers when you ingest their body parts or something, right? And I'm obviously talking about an extreme case, right? Very rare case, obviously very stereotyped, sort of this Western mythology of the rest of the world, right? But there are other aspects about non-escapable identity. If you are Korean, and historically we know that the Koreans and the Japanese have a very problematic history, right? If you're a Korean in Japan, you can't just pretend you're not Korean. You're identifiable, right? A Japanese person would see you as Korean, they would respond to you as Korean, they would treat you differently if you were Korean. So those are not escapable identities. They're not concealable identities. And they behave differently. Now, we do have concealable identities, and are not trying to make a moral ground that you're safer or that you're better off, but we know that there are different types of identities. Some that are chosen internally, and that you can choose to hide when you want to, and some that are given externally, and you cannot hide, right? And obviously, the most clear example is through Charles Mills. Charles Mills' book is Blackness Visible. I will mention it a few times. There's nowhere to hide that you're black, right? And we could talk about, light, dark skin, all of those issues aren't relevant. What matters here is Charles Mills' argument is every time you go out into the world, you're black. And people respond to you being black. And they treat you differently as you're black. And Charles Mills is an author. He's a black male. And he talks about how growing up in the East Coast, and they had stores like bodegas, and I don't think we have a comparable thing in the West Coast. But he would go into a store and he was very likely to be followed. He was more likely to be followed. And if he was walking down the street and he saw a white female, that white female would cross the street to avoid it, right? And so his identity is different, and it's not escapable, right? It's not an escapable identity. Relative to that, Jan Tinkner writes about sex and gender. She talks about lesbians who often could very easily hide their identity. Not that they wanted to hide their identity, but it was a good thing that they did hide their identity. But they could, right? It was perfectly acceptable in the 1950s to have a female roommate because females made less because of wage discrimination. So if you had a female roommate, you could hide that identity partially, right? We know during the Red Scare and McCarthyism, right, that there are a lot of people identified. And outside the United States, right, if they were caught, they could be killed, right? And inside the United States could be killed for their beliefs and their behavior. But the point is what is identity? It's a social construct. And when we're talking about these social constructs, some of them are internal, so we have to ask people what they believe, right? In the scientific sense, if you want to find out if someone is gay, you have to ask them. You can't use external identity, right? Unless you actually, right, I was in the Army during my last hotel, even if someone behaves as if they're gay, that's not proof, right? They have to be seen in a sex act, a same sex with a same-sex partner, right? That's an internal identity that you cannot put to them, right? Whereas external identity, right, things that the society assigns to that individual. And normative aspects both have bad and good aspects. I mean, both have problems in their exchange. I know that's a lot, so if there are any questions, just don't feel like you have to. Okay. So we know that that's a problem. So when we're talking about depth of analysis, obviously quantitative depth is limited, right? Now, in this part, I'm not going to go into every detail. I know that we're behind, and I'm already losing my voice. So I want to get through these slides. We're definitely done with chapter 3, and I promise if we're behind, we'll have an end to this section and an exam, and then we'll just move forward. And I know I'm covering way too much. This is very exciting to me, and I usually have a classroom that I can see their faces if they're sort of glazed over. Because I can see your face, I don't know when you're like done and we should move on. So if we have I used to have a whiteboard, but if we are looking at quantitative methods, every variable has to be coded. And I'm going to take just a minute about coding. Because we just discussed this. This is quite a bit of review. when I want to decide if a country is at war, I have a metric that I use, right? That I use, right? That is assigned to the community that I work with, or that in the research field that I look at, because I'm not working with them right now. And we say that a state is at war, right? That it is in the middle of a war if it has 100, by some standards, or 1,000 battle deaths in a given year, right? That means they're at war. So when I'm coding things, first, how do I count battle deaths, right? A battle death is when two armed groups fight each other, armed and organized, not just someone with a knife, not a murder, right? Not someone with a knife stabbing someone, but two armed and organized groups fight, and in that fight, in that conflict, right, that actual battle, right, you have some deaths. So I have to make sure that those groups are organized. I have to code all of that. Now, as I'm coding all of that, I'm going to lose some detail, right? First, I'm going to take a look and say, who are these groups? Are they organized? How many people were in the groups? Right? What were they armed with? I'm going to get all of this information about them, and then I'm going to reduce that to one number. How many people died in that conflict? And then if it meets a certain threshold, some data sets use 100 and some data sets use 1,000, then I'm going to say they're at war. And I'm going to give that a 1 or a 0, a dichotomous value, where there's only two possible values. And if it's a 1, it's a war. If it's a 0, it's not war. I am losing a lot of data and a lot of context at every single step. And that was me coding that. So if I miscode something, or if I choose a way to code something, I'm introducing bias into the model. I'm introducing something into the quantitative data that if you just look at the data, you would miss, right? And obviously, if you look at it, we have code books that explain all the rules, and we want to make sure we're sticking to the same rules when we're doing this. But there's going to be human error. Someone's going to make a mistake, right? The count's going to be a little off. Or I might be at 990 deaths, and I want that to be a war, a major war. So I'm like, okay, let's look at some subtle cases and let's move them on, right? That I could actually intentionally bias the results, right? That's possible for a scientist. And we know that there's an article by LaCour and Green where data can just be made up, right? We're always got to be cautious of quantitative data. Where did it come from, right? With the benefit is I know, I just told you, the variable is battle deaths, right? So I gave you clear variables. How many battle deaths exist? I define battle deaths, right? There's a clear variable. And it's going to impact whether or not it's a war, right? The variables are very clear. Now, when we're talking about qualitative depth, it's always determined by the author, right? If I were to explain to you the inner workings of the Iranian government, I would do a disservice to you. I don't have the knowledge bases that Dr. Tom for us. There are a lot of former Iranians who are professors, specifically in comparative politics, throughout this country. They have more knowledge than I do. So I can't give the depth that they had. And they're what's called embedded. They were embedded. So the best case you can have is to be embedded. And embedded means that you lived and you involved yourself in that culture and grew to understand that culture, the qualities of it, the behaviors of it, the culture, and the value. That's very rare, right? And in fact, even though Dr. Tarnover, he is an expert on aspects, parts of that, his expertise of Iran is greater than his expertise of Iraq, obviously. And his expertise of Iran and Iraq are greater than his expertise of Zimbabwe, obviously, right? That as you move away from their countries that they know, their ability to know that. Now the other part is this ivory tower concern. When you're looking at qualitative analysis, what you will see sometimes is that the authors are academics, or that they're not actually part of that community. And when they're not part of that community, they miss things, right? There's a book by Severine Autaser, and you don't need to know that person's name, but she has a book called Peaceland. And she was a peace worker. But what she did is she lived in a building, a compound for peace workers, that was separate from the society that she was servicing. She wasn't allowed to go into that society because of fear that she would get harmed. And she didn't operate in that economy. She didn't go to the stores. She didn't speak the language. She didn't spend time with the locals. She lived in her compound, and she filled out paperwork about that community that she got from people on the ground. So people on the ground would fill out paperwork and then send it to her, and then she would document it and put it in an administrative function. And what she found is that she was working as a functionary. She was just filling out paperwork. But when she went outside, because she had some autonomy, she went outside the local population, and she realized that the paperwork she was getting did not reflect the society that she was witnessing. That by leaving this ivory tower, by leaving the safety of the compound, she could get next to the population, and she would find a very different behavior. And what she talked about in her book, right, her book Peaceland, is that she would not have known what to do in that society to help them if she hadn't risked herself to go into that society. She needed to understand them and talk to them and be part of them to do that. So even when you have qualitative analysis, is it really part of the local population? Does it represent the population that they're talking about? Or is it this academic ivory tower? Right? And I talked about the worst case scenario. Anthropologists in the mid-20th century were all male. They just happened to be all male. They didn't happen to be all male, it was systemic, right? There was a reason why they were all male. Females weren't allowed to do that job. And so they would go to these countries and they would talk to them and they would identify and they would say, well, the women in this country aren't politically active, they don't discuss politics, they aren't included in conversation. And what those anthropologists missed in the mid-20th century was that they were male. And they were going to societies where the sexes were segregated. Males and females didn't spend time together. And so, of course, they didn't see females talking about politics because they weren't allowed in the room when this was happening, right? And I talked about this before, right? That was missed. So you need that to speak the language and know the culture. And the other part is that when we start talking about cultures and we want to compare them, we always run into this concern about conceptual stretch. Now, when I talk about conceptual stretch, we're going to deal with this a lot more in democracy. What is a democracy, right? There's some sort of minimal rules, there's some more example rules, but when I'm talking about a country and a culture, how much is the Iraqi and the Iranian culture similar? One, religiously they're separate, right? That they're Shia and Sunni, right? Now, I am not religious in any way, right? So the only thing that I know the difference between Sunni and Shia is that they have a different lineage of succession. That they thought different people should take over after the Prophet died. I know no religions. I didn't grow up with religions, right? The only thing I can say that is one is Sunni and one is Shia. Well, if I don't see any difference in religion, what's the difference between those countries? Now, obviously, if someone lived there, they would explain, right? There are huge differences. Even if the reason why they split isn't that big, they are very different now, right? Shias, right, respond, right, in the same way that the Catholic system respond to a hierarchy. That at the top is Khomeini or Khomeini, right? That they have a system in which you go to the next highest level of religious leader, right? That's not as clear, I mean, in some ways it's clear, but not as clear as the Sunni. So when you're trying to compare the role of religion, if you say, okay, well, Muslim countries behave this way, what do you mean? What does that mean, right? In the same way that if I said Christian countries behave this way, we know that one of the things that makes it much more problematic in South America is that it's much more Catholic. And Catholics have a hierarchy where they answer to the Pope, which means if their government says one thing and the Pope says something different, then they have a problem. And this became very clear, right, in the 14th and 15th and 16th century in Western Europe, when the Pope had to be forcibly separated from his power. There's this thing called the Treaty of Westphalia. It was 1648. Right? And they said, no, if I'm the king of this country, then you don't get to decide the religion. It's my country, I decide the religion. 1648 is the first time you have countries sort of defined as autonomous, sort of separated pieces, right? But we have to be careful about that conceptual stretch. Are we going to treat all religions as just religion or not religion? Are they hierarchical religions? Is it fair to compare Catholics to Shias, or does that not fit? Right? Should Catholics be closer to Baptist and Protestant and then Sunni and Shia? What are the characteristics that we're given? And when we try to do that, we might stretch these ideas. What is religion? What is that concept? And when we stretch, we get confused. And we want to try to avoid that. We want to avoid saying, okay, what is religion and how do we define it? Because remember, this is a scientific perspective. We're trying to get the characters of religion that matter in this aspect, but the actual religion, whether we believe or not, is irrelevant. Right? That's not part of the research that we're doing. Right? And any religion, any scientist would say, right, that your beliefs are somewhat separate from your research, unless your research is part of your beliefs, right, which deals in a different issue that I am not qualified to speak to. Hold on, I think I... One second. I apologize. The YouTube just went out. The slide went out for some reason. It's a touchpad, so I will get a proper... All right. So obviously, what we've started to notice, right, is that we have a lot of repetition. We have a lot of repetition in who we're talking about and the authors that we're using, right? You will see me talk about Stockholm and Gaddis a lot, because in later readings, we're going to start with Stockholm and Gaddis, but in later readings, when we talk about identity, when we talk about legislative branches, we're going to see those authors who are writing in 2015, 2020, they're going to be talking about Stockholm and Gaddis. When we talk about methodology, there's a book by King, Cohen, and Verba. There's a couple of books by authors, but every person who takes an exam in comparative politics as a master's degree or an advanced degree, whether it be a doctorate or a master's, they need to know King, Cohen, and Verba. It's this, the initials KKV are referencing that text, and is often cited when discussing methodology. It talks about how to increase observations. Why is it that Monk and Snyder, we're talking about this missed opportunity of more cases through temporal and subnational breakup of the case? Because KKV introduced this, right? And then in the Sage Handbook, right, on this, right, they reference Monk and Snyder. That article we just discussed is in this article that we're discussing now, right? The critique of it is in this article we're reading now, right? There's a lot of overlap. And so remember, this is an epistemic community. It's a community of people who have come together specifically to develop knowledge. And when they're developing this knowledge, one of the things that they do is that they start to agree on certain definitions and terms, and we want to know what their agreed terminology is. It's important to us to know the answers to these questions, right? How do we share identity? How do we share these terms? Okay. So there are a couple terms that I want to be clear will never have just one definition. A case study, we're going to give this really broad definition. A case study has a unit of analysis. We're going to be talking about states, we're going to be talking about counties or provinces or first administrative districts, or whatever it is, there's going to be some unit of analysis. We're going to say, here's the level. You cannot compare counties to states. The unit analysis has to be same across the board. If we're going to compare counties, all of the cases have to be counties. If we're going to compare states, they all have to be states, right? The unit of analysis has to stay the same for a case study. And there has to be some argument that the observation shares some interaction or context, right? If you say there is religion in this case and there is a population, how do those two interact? Right? How does the religion impact the behavior of the population? How does it impact the economy? Right? One of the things that is in the religion, in the Muslim religion, and I'm not trying to give some sort of here's religion, but one of the things about usury laws that it is inappropriate for someone who's a devout Muslim to gain interest on a loan they give to someone else. Right? So that's what the use of the rules means. So if you're looking at a population that is, right, a state, and it's broken into its little districts or its counties, and you're looking at the economic system, and you see less banking and loans coming from a Muslim country, there might be a religious context to that. There might be this idea of usury being inappropriate, of taking interest on loans being inappropriate, as to why you see less banking. Now, there might be a whole host of other reasons, but you have to consider that religious context. You have to consider that religious context. Now, we're talking about observation. This is another term. When I say observation, I'm going to use it in two different ways. It is going to be problematic. This is that conceptual confusion we consider. The first is that the number of cases is just the N, right? N is the number of cases, and it can also be the number of observations. And that's just lazy language in quantitative measures, right? How many observations, how many cases, what's the N of, how is it large and small N, right? Observation and case are very similar in this context. The other part is a quality or characteristic, right? What did I observe? Right? I observed an empty classroom, right? That tells me something about me, right? That either you're very safe or, right, that you would prefer not to be here in the first place, right? That being on campus isn't what you want to be, right? All of those things are observable aspects that I can pull from what I'm seeing, right? And the number. Now, there are some things that are they being interpreted by the observer? And I talked about this a little bit, right? I can count the number of deaths. But there are some things that I just can't know, that I can't observe. And there are some things that I'm going to say that I directly observed, right? I'm as a researcher, I might say, I directly observed people protesting. Well, how many people did I see protesting? How many people were out in the streets protesting, and how many people were out in the streets just because other people were out in the streets? We see in almost all protests that protests typically gather a crowd. Every time you see a protest, there are either counter-protesters, right, or observers. And so when you say, okay, we saw this many people out in the street, and I'm going to say all of those people were protesters. Well, that's my interpretation, that everyone who marched was a protester, right? But we know, right, if we're sort of talking about the Capitol March, just because it's something that we all have some observation of, right? We know that there were people there at the march who at least claim not to be, right, part of that march, that they were observing, right? We know that there were news cameras out there because we saw the news cameras out there as it was occurring, right? So if I say everyone out there is considered a protester, that's my interpretation that anyone in that street. That's interpreted by an observer, that's influence, right? So there's never any this like pure truth, right? I want to get to this very clearly. If someone asks me what's the absolute truth, I would say that's not a thing that we can do, right? Scientists can only have the observations and any identifiable bias in those observations, right? This absolute truth thing is not something that scientists deal with, right? If you ask someone who does in quantitative metrics, they would talk about 95%, right? If you talk about statistical significance, did you know it's 0.05 level, which means 95% can be explained by the factors in the model, right? So if you ask someone who's quantitative metrics, like, yeah, 95% is the threshold. I'm never absolutely sure. I have a 95% confidence level. I'm confident that 95% of the time this model will work. If you ask someone qualitative, they say this is internally logic, that the logic here is sound, that it makes sense the way that things happen, the theory backs this the way it happens. You very rarely see someone, this is the absolute truth. That's not how scientists work. That's not how science works in general, to say this is the truth, right? That is typically the realm of metaphysics and religion to say, here's the absolute truth. Scientists say here is what we believe based on the evidence, right? This is the evidence that supports our assumptions. That we have tested our hypotheses with this evidence. The other part about an observation, it can be a causal process. And this becomes very complicated. If I hold a pen up and I drop it, I can argue gravity pulled that to the ground. That's very easy. If I see someone, or if someone tells me that they voted for a Democrat, and they work in manufacturing, right? I can argue that their job in manufacturing led them to vote for a Democrat. Right? It's very common because Democrats more likely to support unions and Democrats have a very strong tie, that if someone works in manufacturing, they're more likely to be a Democrat. I'm going to argue that them getting a job in manufacturing is what led them to vote for a Democrat, to vote for the Democratic Party. That's an observation I make, but that's just an interpretation. They might be pro-choice. They might have a whole host of reasons. They might hate Republicans, or they might have just picked the person on the ballot of the name they liked and it happened to be a Democrat, right? When we're looking at these, they're very problematic. And then when we're talking about observation, I talk about a data set, right? A data set is also an aspect of observation, right? And we won't really talk about data sets so much later. So now let's get into the three things that this chapter specifically talks about when it comes to qualitative case studies. And the first is counterfactual analysis. And this is actually pulled from page 56. I wanted to use the words of the text here. You have to do 6 things for counterfactual analysis. The first, you need clearly specified and circumscribed antecedents and consequence. Now, the text is very clear, but the words that they use are not. All that means is you have to have a very clear chronological order. You have to put things in the time that they occurred, right? If this happened on Monday, and this happened on Tuesday, and this happened on Wednesday, this can't cause what happened on Monday. Right? Chronological order just means that things that happen in the future can't affect the past. Right? It has to follow that linear timeline. That's all it means. Right? You have to see, here's what happened in the past, here's what happened after it, and after it, and after it, until we get to the present. And then I expect these things to happen in the future. Then we get to predictions. So I'm going to line all the things up. So I'm going to talk about World War I for this case. It's very clear, most of you know it. So in the 1900s, in the very early 1900s, right, states started engaging in protectionism, right? And this, most of you should know this from like your history classes or whatever. But they just started putting more trade barriers. That they didn't want to buy goods from other countries, and they wanted to sell goods from their country to other countries. And so it caused this problem where every country started engaging in protectionism. They wanted to do that, right? They wanted to sell more goods than they were buying, and they wanted to gather as much wealth as they could. And it created more tension, because every country was arguing that they didn't want to take in more goods, right? You have this tension that builds. Well, why do they take it into protectionism, right? The second step is that you have to have a causal logic. You have to have a logic that explains this order of events. Well, why did they all engage in protectionism? And when we derive that, what's the factors, is that trade theory. But there's this thing called specie. And specie is just gold and silver bullion. And in the time, in the late 1900s and in the early 1900s, the accepted theory was that if you wanted to become wealthy, you had to hoard as much gold, right? Dragons style hoarding, right? You had to hoard as much gold as you possibly could, and by hoarding that gold, you would have more power than other states in the system. And so the logic is sound, right? So now we're doing a counterfactual analysis. We've set up the organization, and we've backed it by some logic, right? We've said how things happen in the logic. Now we're going to alter as few historical facts as possible, right? And I'm going to write, for those of you, I know it's a historical example, maybe you don't know, but this has been used quite a bit. In World War I, tensions were high. And then one individual, Archduke Ferdinand, was assassinated. He was killed. And it was sort of a spark. And a lot of people, when you ask kids in high school or middle school what caused World War I, they would talk about Archduke Ferdinand, because his death was like a spark on a powder keg. Right? His death triggered a bunch of other actions. Right? You had all these alliances. So France got involved, and because France was involved, other countries Brussels had to become involved. and all these alliances and these tensions broke out. But that's just the thing that happened last, before war, right? All of these things happened. Protectionism was happening, tensions were rising, all of these things, nationalism was increasing. So we're going to change this one thing. We're just going to say that Archduke Ferdinand doesn't die, that he survives, that he's not shot in the process. What would change after the fall? What would follow differently? So now I've changed one effect. I followed the third rule. I've altered as few historical facts as possible. The logic behind it is clear, and I've ordered everything chronologically. So now, what does the existing theory say? Well, the existing theory says it doesn't matter. The tensions were going to lead to a war anyways. Even if he doesn't die, the prevailing theories and the nationalism and the identities of those individuals in those states, they were headed towards war anyways. It doesn't matter if that individual died. That was just a moment that sparked it. But eventually, these tensions were rising. They were leading towards a conflict. They were leading towards World War I either way. It's just that that was the moment that sparked it. But if it wasn't for that moment, if it wasn't for Archduke Ferdinand, there would be another assassination, and that would have triggered the war. And we know that there were quite a few assassination attempts during that time period. So eventually, something else would have triggered it. Well, why? Right? What's the theory that would say that? Well, one was mercantilism. Mercantilism was the trade theory that says you have to hoard as much gold, and you want these sort of policies that damage your neighbor in trade, right? Even if you lose money trading, if you lose less money than your neighbor, right? It's not about trying to get the best deal you can. It's about relative gains, right? I want to do better than my neighbor. I'm going to try and damage France if I'm in the UK. I'm going to try and damage them through trade. Right? I'm going to try and hoard all the gold and take from them as much as possible. So the theory still exists that there was going to be tension because they were all trying the same policy, and it caused more and more tension. Also, before World War I and before World War II, nationalism was very high. The French hated the English. The Germans hated the French, right? The Russians hated, right, the Germans. There was a disdain among them that their nation needed to grow and become powerful at the expense of other nations, right? Nationalism was a concept that became very popular in all of these states, that they were better or chosen or had the internal characteristics to take over, and then scarcity. Right? There's only so much gold. There's only so much food. There's only so much to go around. And as they compete, it becomes more and more scarce, especially as they build weapons. Right? The more that you build weapons, the less money you have for food and services and things like that. So eventually there has to be some sort of conflict. Now, I've done that. I said, okay, it's counterfactual. Archduke Ferdinand doesn't die. Even though Archduke Ferdinand doesn't die, the war still happens. So let's look at statistical generalizations, right? Let's look at generalizations. Let's look at places where trade deals are more common. The likelihood that the United States and Canada goes to war is extremely low. Now, in 1812, it wasn't, because there was the war in 1812, right? And Canada, which is still a British colony, burned down the White House in 1814, I think. But one of the things that we've noticed is since then, right, the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico, Canada, and the United States have been trade partners, very strong trade partners, which means they're less likely to go into a conflict, right? The idea that even though in the past Canada has burned down the White House, and right, the United States has taken land from Mexico, right? Texas, parts of California, Nevada, right, all used to belong to Mexico. Even though those things are historically accurate in the 19th century, in the late 20th century and now in the 21st century, we're very strong trade partners. And we can look at the math now and say the more trade deals you have with a country, the less likely you're to go to war. Which means that the statistical generalization, the data is supporting this argument, this counterfactual we have identified. And then the last part is the identification of testable implications in the case or study, in the case under study or related case. And this is where I say, okay, in World War I, even without an assassination, a war would have still occurred. So what about other periods of tension without war? What happens? What's the difference? What are the different things when you have high tension, right? And while you would have to discuss a great deal of differences if you were to talk about a bipolar system where we're talking about Cold War, we could talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis, we have tensions rising. We have the Soviet Union, right, and the United States, right, coming together, getting really close to war, and nuclear war, devastating nuclear war, over Cuba, over missiles being deployed to Cuba. Nuclear-armed warheads on ballistic missiles that could strike the United States, right? That was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And instead of tension, right, which we expected to lead to war, what we see is diplomacy. We see something different happen and a different outcome. And so it supports that counterfactual that the theories were leading to conflict, and why you can still have assassinations. There were assassination attempts on the Cuban president or the Cuban leader, right? There were attempts by the United States to kill Castro, right? The Bay of Pigs, assassination attempts, a whole host of things, right? Eventually, diplomacy de-escalated, right? So we see a case where we can have a counterfactual. What if there wasn't diplomacy? We would likely expect war, and it would fit with all these categories. So counterfactuals are useful, but they have to follow rules. You have to understand the order of events, and you have to follow the logical arguments, right? So sometimes when people talk about counterfactuals, they just say, what if this was different? Let's take a guess. That's not a counterfactual analysis from a scientific perspective. Make sure you take in all of the 6 rules. And I'm saying this because I think this is going to be one of those things that we're going to discuss in an exam. There are 6 clear rules, but a counterfactual has all these pitfalls where you just take guesses. But if you had a counterfactual analysis and you follow these rules, you can approach this scientifically. And I will discuss these 6 rules again. So I know I mentioned the end, like, oh, this is a testable aspect, but that's rude. So it's not like I'm just going to mention it and never come back to it. So now we're talking about this difference between agreement and difference in cases. So we've talked about counterfactual analysis. Now let's talk about how we do a sort of similarities approach to this, right? What are the similarities in the cases that have the same outcome? And Scotch won't guess is really good about this. What is similar in places that have revolution? Well, they typically have autonomous populations. The peasants are free to sort of live their own lives. And we have elite fracture, right? Elites like business owners, industry rulers, right? Elected officials or kings, right? Or other regents. There's some sort of split between them. For whatever reason, right? There's some split between them. And the group that is split off will reach to the peasantry or the class, the lower class, right? So we're often talking about a class-based system, and they'll say, hey, join us, we'll overthrow the government, and then us as elites will take over and we'll help some of you peasantry do better. Or we'll change the world that you live in so that your class does better. Right? We'll help farmers more, or we'll help the poor more, right? And so that elite fracture can lead to revolutions. So those are things that are similar. If we see revolutions, we'll often see autonomous peasant populations, or autonomous proletariat, or whatever the language is that you choose for sort of this lower class. It is very rare not to have a class-based system. And then elites who reach out to them, so they have a fracture between themselves. Because elites don't want to include the lower class. They would prefer not to. But if there's a split between elites, they might need. So those are similar things in those cases. Well, what happens when you have autonomous peasantry and elite fracture, and you don't have a revolution? Sometimes we call it a deviant case. Well, what made it different? What caused it to be different? What were the aspects that are different? Right? Sometimes we'll talk about, right, a repressive regime. Right? There would have been a social revolution in Cuba, but Castro killed off so many people. There would have been a counter-revolution under Stalin, but Stalin disappeared millions of people. Right? All of these factors make it different from other cases. The next part is the scientific aspect of probability versus determinism. So in those cases, we would argue that if there are some things that change, it's likely, it's probable that we see a revolution, or we see democratization, or we see war, right? It's probable that there's a high percentage chance that it will occur. It is probable that temperatures will reach 90 degrees by April. And that might be like too soon, too late. I've only lived here a couple of years, right? But it's going to get warmer really fast, right? We're sort of ending winter already, right? It's February, but here winter goes away very quickly, and we get back into the heat for a long period of time. We're in a very long summer compared to other places. And then this direct correlation is an explanation of the math. I don't expect you to know this as well. I just want you to know what probable is different from deterministic. A deterministic aspect is something that will occur if certain factors exist. Not that it's likely to occur, it will occur. Every one of you will not be enrolled in this class in July. There is a factor, right, whereas the semester ends in May, right? The semester ends in May, grades have to be turned in. Whether you get an A or B or whatever, you will not be in this class in July. That is determinate. It's deterministic. You are in this class now, you will not be in this class in July. Right? If I get sick, it's deterministic that I will not be in this classroom, right? Based on the factors that exist right now. Right? So the deterministic is a really strong argument. It says if these conditions exist, this will occur or will not occur. Right? Deterministic, right? It is deterministic, it's not a percentage chance, it will happen. This leads us to what is called congruence analysis. Now, congruence analysis in quantitative terms just means that when the value of the independent variable changes, the dependent variable changes in some way, right? If you have a change in the number of years that people are educated, then you have a change in the economy, right? More educated populace, more money being made in that economy. That's just quantitative change in regression analysis, right? Purely a probabilistic explanation, right? You should see there's a high chance that you will see a percentage increase in the economy for every year increase in the education level of the population, right? Just because an educated workforce typically makes more money. And if you have a country with a more educated workforce, your economy will grow. What we're going to talk about more often is this idea of best explanation. A best explanation from a qualitative perspective is where you start with a model where you say, this is what I think explains these behaviors. I believe these behaviors are explained by these characteristics. Revolutions are often preceded by an elite split. And then what happens is I'll see a deviant case. I'll see a case that doesn't fit. And I might say, okay, well, there might be something else here. There might be something else here, let's look into it. And say, okay, well, in all the places where there was an elite split, and then a revolution occurred, the population was sort of left to its own devices. But in this case, we had an elite split, but we didn't have an autonomous group. The farmers were cattle ranchers, and they needed the elites constantly to help them with plows and livestock. Right? They weren't free to live their lives, and so it was different in some way. So now I say, okay, well, I don't just need elites, I need autonomous groups. I need an autonomous peasantry or proletariat. That's the only way this revolution is going to occur. And you continue to learn. And so what you think explains it is constantly being modified to take in these other factors and this context, and these qualitative explanations continue to grow. I know we're getting right at that time, so I think I only have a few more slides. So we're going to talk about process tracing for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then that'll be it for today. And there is really only a couple more slides. So So in process tracing, one of the things is we've seen process tracing already. Process tracing is not that different from counterfactual analysis, right? They're different in some ways. We have to keep them separate. But in process tracing, instead of just saying, okay, what if I changed one thing in this order, in this chronological order, I say, what if I just identify and test everything that's in this order? Let's look at everything from beginning to end. Now, the first part about this is what is actually an intervening variable, right? I start with a society, right, that has an elite fracture, and at the end I have a revolution. But along the way, I have all these things that are happening, right? The first domino is not connected to the last domino, right? So as these dominoes, what is actually falling? What does the first domino trigger, right? When you have an elite fracture, if you're not in a democratic society, if you're in a democratic society and you have an elite fracture, they form a separate party and they compete in an election, right? That's actually not that informative for us, right? If the current Republican Party doesn't coalesce, it'll split into two parties. And one of those parties will win over Republicans, right? We'll see that we have this sort of 1990s conservatives, where it's all about saving money, lowering taxes, small business, and then you have this sort of identity, making sure that, right, that we maintain the culture and the values and the beliefs of America, right? You have these two Republican parties right now. So when you have a split that way, you just have a different election. I'm talking about when you have a split where one of the elite groups says we have to get rid of the other elite group and replace it with a new regime or a new government or a new institutions. And so along these dominoes, what is triggered? Now, sometimes we're going to be testing not correlation, but just mechanisms, right? We're not trying to see how much these things change each other. We're just trying to see if they trigger one another in a series, right? So the order should be, first we see if there's causal mechanisms, and then we do regression analysis, then we look at quantitative research. Now, the part about this is really difficult is process tracing goes, these groups of elites didn't like the other group for some reason. We believe that, even though we can't document it. Then they reached out to a poorer class, a lower class, or farmers, or whatever the group is that is the lower class, because of the largest, right? The reason why elites have to reach out to peasantry or proletariat or the working class is because it's the largest class. The working class is the largest class. So elites don't do it because they need some help. They do it because that's the masses, right? They reached out to the masses because if you're going to take over a government forcefully with violence, you need lots of people, right? It's a tactic, not some ideologically driven thing. So then, why did they reach out? Do they expect some expanse? And then why does the masses choose one group or another? And how do we really know? And I'm going to take one more minute to explain this idea of rationality. There's a book by Tabor and Loge, and it's called The Rationalizing Voter. And in it, they say that your emotional reaction happens 300 milliseconds before your logical reaction. Your brain actually responds emotionally before you comprehend the thing that you're hearing, right? Sometimes Justice Scalia would call this the yuck factor, right? The late Justice Scalia. When you hear something, first you go, what's my emotional response? And then later, even though it's only 300 milliseconds, which is 3/10 of a second, no, less than 3/10, 3/100. What's wrong? 3/10. Less than a second. You have a logical response, right, where you say, okay, now let me absorb the information and process the information I have to see how I respond to that. But before you did that, you had an emotional response. So if your emotional response occurs first, and it doesn't fit with your logic, a lot of people would suggest that your logic would take over. But what we have seen is that if your logic doesn't fit with your emotion, you reject the new evidence. You say, no, that doesn't agree with how I feel, so I disagree with that. Right? My mother has the saying that she feels it's true. Right? My mother would say, oh, I feel like that's true. That's not how truth works, but right? I feel like that's a fact. Well, that's not how that works. But she is expressing this rationalizing aspect. I feel this way, and therefore that's what I'm going to accept as true, even if it's not true. And so this becomes part of this observation of process tracing. Why did they behave the way that they did? Are we really observing that? Or is that what fits with our preconceived notions? Right? And that's part of the aspect of process tracing that we have to think about. Okay, I am going to go over the last 2 slides. We have so much to cover. I appreciate you guys coming in. If you want to talk to me during office hours, if you have questions, we are really far behind, but I believe I can get us caught up over the next couple sessions. After exam 1, it's going to become very clear. I think all the technologies here, I'd like to clean it up a little bit. I'm going to send out the quiz tonight, so you'll have this week to take it. And then it will only have this and more of the Peters book. I'm not going to ask you questions on chapter 4 because I'd like to discuss it with you before I put that into a quiz. If you want to talk to me, you can always contact me. The next part is a poll. So if you see the poll, please do it. It's extra credit. Extra credit always helps you. And then I want to see if you want to consolidate how many of you want to be, how many of you want to be in the WebEx, how many of you want to be on the YouTube chat. It seems like YouTube is waiting out, but I want to make sure everyone can ask the questions they want to ask. So just take all that into account. Thank you for spending the time here, and I will see you.